Hi, I'm John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. This is part 2 of the Oral World, where we're going to discuss a little bit more about how analogical thinking works amongst oral societies and how writing changes analogical thought into analytical thought. We're also going to explain how polytheism and monotheism are products of oral and literate cognition, and we'll get into the evolution of how religion and the idea of the sacred went from cosmology to ritual to finally a written book. Like, subscribe, share, and please join the fun. I want to expand on this idea of analogical thinking, oral thinking. Just so that we can kind of clarify, and hopefully I can clarify, because this is so important to try to grasp. Look, Walter Ong, in his book Orality and Deity, just admits right up front that there is a permanent epistemological divide between oral thinking and literate thinking. What he's saying is there are aspects of oral societies that we cannot recover. They only exist within that society, and we can't. We look back, it looks so strange, it looks so different because it is different. You know, the brain has rewired itself through literacy. The culture has rewired itself through literacy, and they're just aspects that are beyond our memory or comprehension. So look, imagine living in a world where there is no writing. We can't, because we think via writing. But in that world, there is an observer and what they observe. The observer and the observed is the object of thought, right? And that's nature. Nature, everything around them. The sky, the sun, moon, stars, plants, animals, the tribe, people, everything around them. What you observe is your object of thought. So your vocabulary is basically words of things you see. So you have a word for tree, and you have a word for plant, and you have a word for seed, you have a word for woman, child, sheep, goat, cow, bird, wind, right? You also have words for things you experience. Love, pain, suffering, right? Good and evil. There are abstract concepts, but people experience a neighboring village comes in and plunders your village and kills your men and sons and rapes your women and daughters. This happened repeatedly. And so, they developed a vocabulary to describe this kind of behavior. Well, it turns out you have reductive vocabularies because your vocabularies are only the things you see or experience. And everything you do is encapsulated in concrete descriptions. Again, that Siberian village had no word for circle or square. They named a circle a moon or a plate, the square a house or a door, right? These are concrete descriptions of things that you see. Okay. Now, when writing is invented, and again, it takes about 3,000 years for this transition between orality and literacy. But what happens is you have an observer, you have what you see, your object of thought, this thing in nature, above and below. And now you have something in between. You have writing. And now you don't have to look exactly at the object of nature. You're now looking at words on a page which actually eventually do not resemble anything in nature. You're just looking at symbols on a page, and that is now how you are going to access what you observe. This changes everything. Because now, instead of relating to an object by observing it, you're relating to an object solely by thinking about it, by referencing things that don't have anything to do with it. Now, initially they did, But writing, is just symbols on a page that no longer have to be attached to the thing that was once observed. It's important to note our early alphabets were logographic alphabets, right? They were symbols that represented not just sounds, but whole concepts. Like in Egyptian, an arm holding a loaf of bread meant offering. But it was a picture of an arm holding an offering, and that's what meant offering, right? And so there's all these logographic alphabets that still have pictorial representations in them. Those alphabets tend to have, hundreds of characters, sometimes thousands. This is why in China invented a printing press almost 1,000 years before the Europeans did. But there was no scientific revolution in China. And one of the reasons is because the Chinese alphabet was thousands of characters. It was logographic. And in order to train yourself in learning that alphabet, well, it took a lifetime. The European alphabets were, all less than 30 characters long, and they included vowel representations. Extremely easy to learn. And, you could learn them as a child, and then it was all literate thinking thereafter. And so it's just the medium is the message. The medium of the alphabet, the reductive alphabet that included vowel representations, helped the development of literate scientific thinking in the Western world. All right, so when you put writing in between what you observe and yourself, you begin a process of abstracting what you observe, right? Because you're no longer tied by describing what you observe in language and reductive vocabularies. Your words only describe what you see. But if you're no longer seeing the object in nature and you're just looking at words in a page, you're free to start permutating your ideas. And then you start comparing and contrasting, not necessarily object to object in nature, you do that, but now words to words. And over time, you start building a framework of analytical thought where you can start taking objects and turning them into objects of thought as opposed to just concrete objects of nature. You see a circle and you say, this is a circle and it is a generic form, all things in this shape. We're going to give it its own vocabulary, circle. Oral peoples don't do that. There's no word for circle. It's it's an actual object that they see. Well, over time, the writing becomes your object of thought, right? So the observer is looking at an object in nature. Writing is invented. That's a layer of reflection between the observer and what you observe. And over time, it's that layer of reflection that becomes the whole arena of thought. Writing now becomes the object of thought as opposed to just objects in nature. And when that happens, you have developed literate thinking. And now you have expansive vocabularies, analytical thinking, and you start abstracting all kinds of things out of the natural world that oral societies do not do. Just as, to follow up on this, I'm going to take this relationship between orality and literacy and diagram it as a sentence. In oral thinking, what you observe is nature, and that would be the subject of your sentence. Every object in nature has a function. There's something that it does. And this is what oral societies watch. This is what they want to know. What does that thing do? This river runs, it rises in certain times of the year, lowers in other times of the year. We need to know when that happens to irrigate our crops. So there's a function of rising and lowering. It's tied to the seasons, to the weather, to the rains, to when the sun is in a certain position, when a star rises in the pre-dawn light. They make all these analogical connections. That is the function. Now, what they want to do is that, well, actually what they do is they equate what a thing does, its function, with the thing. There's no separation. The river is the thing that waters our crops. That's what we want, right? Or it's the thing that attracts the animals. That's what we want. So they equate the agriculture or the migrations of the animals with the river, the high tide, the low tide of when it rises and sinks, right? They're equating all these things. Now, what they want to do is they want to ensure that the river will keep behaving the way they have observed that it behaves, because sometimes it doesn't flood when it's expected to flood. And sometimes there are long periods of drought which are abnormal, and we can't have that. We need the river to be consistent. So they want to take the function of the river, what it does, and they want to maintain it so that its function can serve the culture that they are living in, right? So that they can grow their crops, for example. In order to do that, they perform a ritual which takes the object and its function, and they perform a ritual which will maintain that relationship and bring that function into society. This is how oral people think. And so the object in nature is the subject, the ritual is the verb, the function of that object is, the predicate nominative, the predicate adjective, it's the renaming of the subject, and it's through ritual action that the function of nature and the object of nature are equated and then brought into society. This is oral thinking. Well, what happens is when writing is invented, this relationship changes. It takes centuries, but it changes. The function of the objects in nature become what they do, and we don't equate their function specifically with the object itself. Writing becomes how we describe the objects. It's the predicate modifier. So as a result, we start abstracting the objects in nature, and writing slowly starts replacing our ideas and our observations. In oral societies, there are some different rules for what a person should know. And again, this is completely different than our modern sensibilities. But there is a silence principle in oral societies. And, the first obvious principle is what is never said is eventually forgotten. This should seem obvious, but if you don't write a thing down and you don't repeat it, it gets forgotten. And it turns out, that happens because knowledge in an oral society is stratified. Knowledge was considered sacred. And so in order to obtain certain levels of knowledge, you had to be initiated in ritual cycles to obtain that level of knowledge. In literate societies, you go to university and you're initiated and you put on, fancy pants and a cap and gown and you graduate and you're given a new name. I mean, there is an echo of this kind of process that has been going on for thousands of years, but it's just important to note that if the thing is kept silent long enough, it is forgotten. And actually, that's most things in ancient history have been forgotten. We'll talk about that in another episode. Well, what was never said? Well, here's another problem when it comes to myth in the Bible. The heart of the sacred tradition was considered to be so sacred that it was not for public consumption. It was secret. The sacred was often secret, accessed only through initiation. What does that mean? It means we would look in vain to find the heart of the sacred tradition of the ancient Israelite temple cult in the Bible. It would never be written down. The heart of the Israelite temple cult does not make it into our text. That is part of the rules of oral societies. So what does this mean? Well, it's not just, again, in these ancient cultures, in these ancient, primary, secondary, oral cultures, there is no word for religion. And so it's not just their religion that was considered sacred and therefore secret, but their philosophies and their sciences. And you look at the Great Pyramid in Egypt. It's, spectacular, and many people have noted it has mathematical precision. How did they do it? I mean, it is phenomenal. Has geometric precision, mathematical precision. We don't get any blueprints in ancient Egyptian writings. We get certain deities that are in charge of building and constructing, and they show up with their tools and then their ritual phrases and their songs and dances. And so, we just think this is a bunch of bugaboo, but then we look at the pyramid and then we realize, well, they actually did have a science of weights, of measures, of physics, of geometry, of mathematics, but it doesn't make it to us. And most of it is because it wasn't written down. So it's not just the heart of ancient religion, it's the heart of ancient science that doesn't get written down. We have a saying in modern academia, publish or perish. In the ancient world, it is the exact opposite. If you publish, you will perish. If you betrayed the secrets of the cult or, of the center of the order, you would be banned or executed. So, that was pretty convincing that you shouldn't say anything. Sacred knowledge was often the object of initiations. Technological science, they were the secrets of the trade. None of this stuff is written down. And therefore, the true sophistication of world societies has been lost. I mean, again, for the longest time, all the way up until the 1970s, people were still preaching that, the builders of Stonehenge were a bunch of howling barbarians. And now, we've reconsidered and realized, well, actually, they're people just like us. And they had different culture and different metaphysics. They were oral. They had horizontal memory. They couldn't build space rockets or microchips. But they could develop very sophisticated astronomical alignments in standing stones. And that belays a social sophistication, a religious sophistication, an astronomical sophistication, a calendar sophistication. And, suddenly these people are a lot like us. Now remember, in oral societies, there is what you see and its function. Well, it turns out there are a lot of things in nature, so you can see a lot, and you do develop, thousands of words in your vocabulary to describe what you see. And that takes a lot of memory organization. This tree grows at this time, it grows this particular seed, which you have to plant at this time, and, the fruit is best ripe if you pick it at this time. And then, so that's what it does, but then there's a function behind it. The seed is produced at this particular season when there's the rains or the winds, or the sun's in this position on the horizon, there's a certain star that rises on the horizon. They make all these analogical connections. Now, how do you organize all that together? Well, in oral societies, you start personifying the principles of nature. And for decades, our textbooks said that ancient primitive peoples, quote unquote, were nature worshipers, and all their deities were, part of nature, and this is what they did. Well, that's true, but that isn't because they're primitive. That's because they're oral. This is how the oral brain conceptualizes the world. You look at the objects of nature, you look at their functions. In order to remember them, you personify them. So now, the function of that object in nature takes on a personification. It is a spirit, which is another way of saying a divine will. We would call it a principle. We have words for the principles of nature. Fertilization, planting, gestation. They don't have words for this, but they recognize there's a function that is occurring. And so they will assign it a name, and that the name is generally a deity. It's a spirit. And so this function in nature is part of that spirit, and it gets assigned a deity. That function in nature gets assigned a deity, and that function in nature gets assigned a deity. Suddenly you have a polytheistic pantheon, which is dividing all your experience of nature. And you can pray to that deity when you want that function of nature to help you in your society. You pray to this deity, and so this religious framework develops. It's all a product of oral cognition. Polytheism is a direct result of orality. If you and I were born in an oral world, we would be polytheists. Well, some oral societies aren't technically polytheists. They're what is called henotheistic, sometimes monopolytheistic. That is, they still have to divide up the visible cosmos in different personifications. But they have one supreme deity that's at the top, that organizes and creates everything. Either a father figure or a mother figure, often called that. But that figure has a retinue of divine subordinates that help run the cosmos. So as opposed to a polytheistic system where there are multiple gods running the cosmos, in a henotheistic system there's one god who's at the head, and he has a sort of divine council of subordinates that help him run the cosmos. All right, and then of course we have monotheism, which is there's only one god. Technically, monotheism is probably impossible to develop in a primary oral society when there's no concept of writing. Just to manage how nature operates, you have to divide things up, and you have to divide them up in memorable form, and the human brain decided to personify those memorable forms, and you create polytheistic systems as a result. All right, so monotheism is largely a product of literacy. And what that means is the early Israelites, who, 95% of them did not read or write, how could they be monotheistic? They weren't. And in fact, the Bible tells us repeatedly that the Israelites kept worshiping the gods of their neighbors. This was seen as a big sin, but it turns out they were hardwired to be polytheists. They're not strictly monotheists until they're fully literate, writing the Torah at the end of the biblical narrative, of the Old Testament narrative. So, Abraham and Moses are polytheists. Now, technically, they're probably henotheists. They probably believe in one supreme deity with a bunch of divine subordinates. And that's where Israelite religion probably begins, in henotheism, that slowly, through the written word, becomes monotheism. And finally, we have here our, in a primary oral world, there is no conception of writing. The idea of the sacred is encoded in the cosmology of the cult. I'll have a whole presentation on this. Later on, it's in the ritual of the cult that is the idea of the sacred, and of course there's huge overlap. Finally, it's only in literate societies that the sacred becomes a written text. It becomes a book, and the holy word, the sacred word of God, now becomes a text which is historicized, because that's how literate peoples think truth is historical truth. And so the whole point of this slide is to show you there is this long arc of history from the transition of primary oral society that is run by the functions of nature, that slowly develops into empires and city-states, and now nature can be completely manipulated through grand ritual cycles, which is what happens. And then, slowly, literacy develops, and then the sacred becomes a book, the sacred text. We are at the tail end of this. Even in the first century, the early Christians, the first century Christians, still had their toes in this orthopraxic ritual world. Here we are in the 21st century, and we have utterly forgotten that world. So as we start developing and looking into narratives in the Bible, we will repeatedly come back to these frameworks and say, what does this conceptual framework help us? How does it help us interpret this narrative?